Okay, so let's further delve into your specialization, that is the fintech industry, and let's just talk about the fintech industry now, to be more
Sure,
precise.
sure. So I think Indian fintech has evolved, though it's still moving at a much slower pace compared to China or the US. But that's by design. So Indian financial ecosystem is something that we need to understand better if we have to really talk about what trends we are probably going to see in Indian fintech. So Indian financial ecosystem is very business driven. Right. So today in India, small businesses contribute 45% of the GDP. They employ 35% of the Indian population. So whatever happens is going to be very small business driven. Right. And that's why Rupifi focuses on small businesses, because we understand that this is a large segment to go after. Indian fintech is a very heavily regulated space right now, because India, right from the liberalization times of 1990s, has focused a lot on regulation.
Right.
So compared to China, where regulation kicked in much later and then had a strong impact and immediate impact on the space, Indian regulation or regulatory system has been there right from the beginning and has had slow but impactful decisions taken at every point of time. Right? It's like you let a space reach from 0 to 100, and then a regulation comes in and it drops from 100 to 50. The Indian fintech space has actually grown from 0 to 5 with the regulation coming, and 5 has not become 2, but it has just become 4.5.
Okay.
But that has also led to that 4.5 becoming 20.
Okay.
And then another regulation comes in,
Right.
which is more like a correction.
Right.
So it's like that market correction
So
that
I'm so
has
sorry,
happened.
I'm interrupting you, but also one more thing. So do you think that these regulations are also not progressing the Indian fintech space from like say 0 to 50 or 0 to 100, but instead making it go like 0 to 5, 0 to 20? Is it
in
like
smaller steps?
in smaller steps? Is that also due to regulation? Because a very specific case of regulation comes to my mind when I think about this. Specifically in this decade itself, I believe the regulations which came from RBI in the NBFC P2P sector, for example, that was something that was not expected and it was
Yeah.
quite unique, right?
Yeah.
And I think that would be a perfect example of going to 0 to 5 and then going from 0.0 to 5 to 5
Yeah.
to 4.5, right?
Yes. So Gautam, I think NBFC P2P is actually a classic example, or rather more peculiar example. I would not generalize what happened on the P2P side when I speak about regulation. I think we'll come to that separately.
Makes sense.
But all other spaces, what I would say, since you mentioned Niti Aayog, for example, there is an iSpirit organization. Nandan Nilekani led a lot of initiatives for India. So I think India has given the global financial ecosystem a lot of things that they can learn from. The entire Aadhaar stack that has been built is an example for the world. UPI is an innovation, an example for the world to copy and to use, right? And this has been possible because the required regulatory measures were in place. So I would say Indian regulation, or regulator rather, has been very watchful of what has worked and not worked. They have been progressive with respect to things that have worked outside, and they have been a bit conservative when it comes to things that have not worked outside. P2P is the example of the latter, where they have seen P2P as an industry evolve, the downsides of P2P exploding suddenly. And that's where RBI from day one has been very, very conservative about how they want to see the NBFC P2P space in India. But I would still say the entire regulation of P2P companies having their separate NBFC license, like an NBFC P2P, is a very, very advanced sort of regulation when you talk about it.
Right.
It's a separate construct that they have formed. That means they've spent a lot of time in a space which is completely technology driven, right? You don't expect RBI or a regulator, especially a financial regulator in a in a country like India, to be so progressive when it comes to a small section. Because today P2P, in terms of overall volumes, whether it's lending, is a fraction,
Right.
right? Even after those regulations. So if the question is it because of that regulation? Probably yes, to some extent. But I think that 0 to 5 being slow is only going to help the 5 to 50 becoming a bit faster,
Becoming a bit more organized.
more organized,
Right.
much more stable
Got it. Got it.
to market pressures.
Right. So the next aspect of the Indian fintech sector, which I want to focus on, would be say the simple case of supply and demand, right? Like a lot of the trends in the current Indian fintech system depend on digitization and the move towards cashlessness in India, right? But as we can see, there are many suppliers or companies in the fintech space increasing, right? We are seeing various lenders coming into the picture. We are seeing various insurance companies coming into the picture, various unique solutions. Do you feel that at the same time the demand side for that space, like your consumers, your SMEs, your general folk people, are they also aggressively increasing at the same time? I mean, is the supply meeting the demand, or is it something? And I mean, I also want to focus on how, say, you look at companies such as Flipkart or Ola, they are also now coming into the financial services sector as well, right? Ola has released a credit solution, Flipkart is releasing a credit solution. I mean, that's what the news says. So we see a lot of supply side players coming into the picture. So do you see that the demand side is meeting that, or is there oversaturation, or is the Indian heartland still largely untapped?
Sure. I think there are multiple questions that I can hear, Gautam, here. So, first is there enough demand?
Right.
Right? Are we seeing that the space has become crowded with too much supply? Uh, I think the way supply demand works is there is always an imbalance, and the other side tries to then reach a balance. Uh, the equilibrium is established, but then it again, because of one side growing, it again reaches a stage where if the demand was higher, now suddenly the supply becomes higher, and then the demand tries to adjust, or you create demand, whether artificial or actual. So take the e-commerce example for sake of this discussion. There was a demand that existed, which companies like Flipkart and Amazon understood. They came into the market, captured a part of the market, which was tier one towns, primarily the metros, the people who were using mobile phones, who were using internet, and they were able to tap into that market. Then there was a time when you had a lot of e-commerce companies suddenly, right? Some of those names we will not even remember today, right? There were tons of e-commerce companies out there, all trying to give discounts. You could compare prices, and you could even get 10 sites giving the same product for between 150 to 100 rupees, and you can actually go and buy from the cheapest option available to you. Obviously that was not very much sustainable, so there was a correction, right? Only the strongest players survived. Then with growing sustainability and them being in the industry for long, they understood the customer. Then there was another demand created, which was in the tier 2, tier 3 towns. And then there was again a growth that happened of these players after consolidation, or after some of the players who did not survive, them shutting down. So I think that's how pretty much it is happening on the fintech side also. There was a time when lending was broken. Companies and startups realized, or people realized, that there is a need for digital lending. There is a need for companies on the consumer and the business lending side. Companies came in. Then there was a bit of a crowd because capital infusion was happening. A lot of companies were trying to solve the same problem. Cost of acquisition went up because now there were 20 companies fighting for the same customer. Because initially, when you see business models focus on a segment of the total customer base. So they were all focusing on the same metro customer initially. He's easier to reach out. He's far more educated, easier to crack. Over time, there was consolidation. Some of these companies could not survive. They could not either raise money or could not afford that high cost of acquisition. And they kind of vanished from the space. And now most of the companies that have survived are focusing on the next set of customers. Right? So they're creating, they're creating that demand. They're creating channels to improve their cost of acquisition. So that's essentially how all these sectors behave, whether it's commerce, whether it's travel. And we have numerous case studies that we can create. How there was a time when every third startup was a travel startup, right? Which we don't remember today. How there was a time when every third company was an e-commerce company. Today, we see a lot of fintech happening. So it's a cycle, like the dot-com cycle that happened. There was a huge burst of technology companies. Today, it's fintech in the overall startup space. Because there is a need in an economic like India. You first go towards consumerism. And then to power that consumerism, you have to give credit. So that's what people did. First, the Flipkarts came and they made people buy. Now they want people to continue buying, so you'll have to give them credit. Similarly, the Olas came, they made people ride. Now to ensure that people ride without friction, you give them credit. So product follows another. It's a journey for most of these, for most companies, not just them. I mean, at Rupifi also we will evolve. We'll offer a product, understand our customer, create a demand, try to solve it. And once we have supply, enough on the supply side, we'll probably try and create demand for maybe not the same product, but another product.
Got it.
Right? And that's how I see this whole demand supply equation balancing out. It's tough to say whether there is oversupply right now. I'll say there could be a situation where it's not oversupply, but the same supply or that supply pool is catering to a very limited pool of demand. There is another demand that exists, but purely because of operational and ease of reaching out reasons. All suppliers are going after the same demand, small pool of demand. Instead of looking at there is another set of demand that exists. Why don't people reach out there? So I think that's how supply and demand works.
The Indianaut Podcast is available on YouTube, Apple Music, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. Be sure to follow us on Instagram and Facebook to receive all updates on the upcoming episodes. Thank you once again.